wondering what a person who talks about chocolate is doing on a panel about fish. My book was about food security and agricultural biodiversity specifically. And when you were talking about the bats and the tequila, it really reinforced for me that deliciousness, savoring, is one of the most important ways that we the eaters, become involved in supporting food security and biodiversity. For those of you in the back of the room, there are a couple of seats up front if you want to come closer. You'll also find chocolate in your hand. I'm going to ask you to please wait to eat that. I know it might be the hardest request of the day. The session is called The Wild Table, and while my fellow speakers will emphasize the wild, I want to talk to you about the table. The table is where we meet. The table is, I didn't realize all these slides were on a timer. Can someone stop the timer? Or I'll just let them all go and you guys will just be free with them. Just enjoy them. That's what we'll do. Yeah, don't worry about it. I think it's more hassle than it's worth. Yeah, so let me say this before I go on to the table. The slides behind me are images of cacao. Cacao is a pod-shaped fruit. The seeds of the fruit are what ultimately become chocolate. So you're seeing, they would have been synced with what I was saying, but it doesn't matter. You're seeing them in all their kind of incarnations all the way through to chocolate. So what I wanted to say was that the table is where we meet. The table is where we feed each other and where we are fed. And that focus sometimes gets lost when we move into abstractions around notions of biodiversity, when we talk about our food system rather than the table. It sometimes feels like something that's really far away, but I want you to know that everything Terry, Nigel, Kelsey, and I will share comes back to this fundamental question: how do we nourish each other? And how will we nourish each other? I'm going to talk about this through the food of the gods that you have in your hand, that chocolate. Fish was a little tricky and less fun after lunch. But I want you to map what I am saying onto fish, fowl, whatever it is that you love. So let's start there. I'd like you to close your eyes and think of a food that brings you joy or solace. Just take these few seconds to let whatever comes to mind come to mind, and then go ahead and open your eyes. For me, the food that comes to mind is chocolate. In my past life as an academic, I spent years poring over research on the barriers to engagement around environmentalism and sustainability. The shorthand is I had been doing all of this work, and I couldn't understand why I was repeating myself. Year after year, I was talking about the same information, and we weren't seeing the kind of noticeable change that one would expect after so many years of dialogue around recycling, around insulating your home, around conserving water, that we were still talking about the same things. And so I decided to try to understand why and to look at the psychology behind how we act. And I want to share some of that here. We know water's a finite resource. We know eating lower on the food chain is better for us and for the planet. Why don't we respond accordingly? Behavioral economists Deborah Linville and Gregory Fisher coined a phrase called the finite pool of worry. And out of all the research that I did, hundreds of studies that I poured over, this one was the one that I carry with me and want you to carry with you, which is there's only so much that we can worry about at one time. If we want someone to care about the things that we are concerned with, we have one of two choices. We either displace something in their pool of worry, their finite pool of worry, the handful of things that we can worry about at one time, or we work within existing cares. And that's why food holds so much power. Food is in our consciousness and in our mouths. It brings us pleasure, it reinforces what we value, and fortifies our sense of belonging. And it is in our finite pool of worry. In whatever manifestation it holds, it may be in many of our pools of concern. Chocolate is a substance that for most of us in this room, we've had a considerable relationship with. For me, it was my every birthday cake. It was my wedding cake. It got me through my divorce. Yet, if you had asked me 5 years ago where chocolate came from, I couldn't have told you. 5 years ago, nearly to the day, I was in Esmeraldas in Ecuador, and I was visiting the cocoa forest for the first time, and in my head, the soundtrack was, where's the chocolate? Wait, is it a sap? Is something brown going to ooze out of this giant pod? Where's the chocolate? And at every juncture, I was biting. You'll see. Oh, well, it's over now, I guess. Okay, you saw images. PowerPoint. That's where I felled by PowerPoint. This fruit here. Okay, Alejandra Arces is the name of this woman. And she is a part-time manicurist, which is obvious from those gorgeous nails. The pulp around the fruit is chocolate there. Around the seed, no. Tastes of lemon and peanut and butterscotch and honeydew were there. I bit into the seed, like this woman is doing here. Is the chocolate there? No, not yet. It's not there either. There are many steps that go into chocolate ultimately manifesting. But I wouldn't have known this, not from tasting those seeds, not from describing the taste that we would receive once those bitter seeds are harvested, fermented, dried, roasted, and processed to become what we know as cocoa beans. I thought chocolate, as we think of many foods, was singular, not multiple. I care deeply about food, but I relegated this idea of terroir, or a taste of place, to a handful of foods like wine and cheese. But nearly every food and drink can reflect a taste of place if we let it. And that reflection of a taste of place is also a reflection of biodiversity. Now, our industrialized food system values sameness, which of course is valuable and necessary to a point. We need efficiencies that we get in large-scale agriculture, and consistency in the kitchen, any chef will tell you, is incredibly important. But what the commoditization of many foods has done is made them fungible. I have an MBA, so I decided to throw out that economic term. Fungible. Crops become akin to widgets, right? What that means is fungibility is interchangeability. So grain grown in Kansas gets blended in with grain from the South, and all of a sudden that corn or wheat comes from everywhere and nowhere, right? With no recognition of seasonality, with no recognition that the harvests are different, that some are fed by rain, some are parched by drought, that both are touched by combines and calloused hands. These stories disappear. They disappear into all-purpose flour, they disappear into high fructose corn syrup, and the loss is multiple. It erases farmers like another farmer that you saw in my slides, Vicente Norero, right? It compromises what we'll be able to eat in the future, seed by seed and meal by meal, eroding the biodiversity in every element that makes food and agriculture possible. Now, these losses in biodiversity are buried. They're buried in the soil, they're tucked in beehives, they're hidden in cattle feedlots. They start with microorganisms that are invisible to the naked eye, and they echo through every link in our food chain, from soil to seed to pollinator, from plant to fish to animal, from cacao blossom to cocoa pod to chocolate bar, compromising the very ecosystems that make much of our food possible. It's very hard, at least for me, to think about this in broad brushstrokes, to think about whole ecosystems, to think about huge swaths of our food being compromised. But according to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, 95% of our food, of the world's calories to be more specific, now comes from 30 species. Of 30,000 edible plant species, we cultivate about 150. Of 90% of the food that we get from livestock, it comes from only 14 animals. So now 3/4 of the world's food comes from just 12 plant and 5 animal species. Okay, why does this matter? Because diversity gives us options. In the face of a growing population, climate change, disease, and pests, we don't know what kinds of traits we might need to breed into the foods that we eat in the future. This panel is about biodiversity and food security, right? So we want to ensure that we have food to eat in the future. And one of our greatest backup systems is preserving agricultural biodiversity. Agricultural biodiversity is the diversity in every single component that makes food possible. It's saving the bats, it's saving the bees, it's saving the diversity in the kinds of cacao that's grown, in the kinds of wheat that's grown. It echoes through every part of our food system. And you know, if you think of it like an investment strategy, if you had money to invest, no investment advisor would say, put it all into 5 stocks and you'll be okay, right? You would want to diversify so you would have options for the future. But that's exactly what we're doing with food. We're putting all of our eggs, so to speak, in one basket. And that basket, those 12 plant and 5 animal species that I just referenced, were bred largely for yield and resistance to environmental challenges, such as resistance to drought, right, or resistance to disease. They weren't bred for what gets me to the table. They weren't bred for taste. Most weren't bred for, was that clap for timing? It's at 10. Wow, okay, they weren't bred for, I thought you were just cheering me on because that was like such a great statement, like, yes! They weren't bred for flavor, what we care about. Okay, so let's hop ahead here because I am very far behind no matter how quickly I timed this. I'd like you to reach for that chocolate. I'd like to give you the embodied experience of saving foods by savoring them. The way conservationists, go ahead and open up the blue one, please. It's a 74% chocolate that is made from cocoa from Brazil. The chocolate makers are in the room, and I will get to introducing them in one moment, but I want to say this first. Go ahead and open up the blue, smell the chocolate, and break off a small piece and put it in your mouth, and savor. So conservationists lay out 3 primary ways that we conserve biodiversity in food, well, in all things. Ex situ conservation is saving this biodiversity out of place. We save it in a seed bank, for example, or when it comes to cocoa, to cacao, in a germplasm repository where we grow the plants. The second way is in situ, in place conservation in the wild. We save the wild places where our foods and drinks grow. This comes from one of those places, from the Amazon and from the Atlantic rainforest. The chocolate that you're tasting right now comes from the Atlantic rainforest. The third way that conservationists talk about saving biodiversity is on farms. We save it by growing it. We grow the diverse varieties. 70% of the cocoa that's grown in the world that becomes chocolate is grown in West Africa, predominantly in Ivory Coast and in Ghana. The same hybrid varieties are grown over and over again, and the kind of diversity that you're tasting right now is lost. By saving the diversity, we save something precious. We save flavor. We save genetics. We save the places where these different foods and drinks are grown. And we save the stories of the people who grew them, not only the ecosystems, but the whole identity of a culture and a people. Conservationists, as I say, lay out these 3 pathways to conserving biodiversity, but they leave us out of the equation, the eaters. And I believe we have to be front and center. We can't save these diverse varieties of cocoa or any other food on farm if we don't have a market for it. So that's where we come into the picture. This chocolate was made by Harper McCaw. They're a chocolate company based here in Washington, D.C., by Sarah and Colin Hartman. Sarah is a Brazilian chocolate maker, and Colin is a veteran of the Marine Corps, and they work exclusively with cocoa that's sourced from Brazil's Atlantic and Amazon rainforests, 2 of the world's most threatened biomes. I'd like you to go ahead and take a sip of water if you have it to clear your palate, and then move to the green envelope. It's a 67% dark blend of chocolate that's from 2 different places, Tomeaçu and also Vale do Juliana. I'm butchering the Portuguese, forgive me please. Vale de Juliana is just off the coast of Brazil's Atlantic rainforest. And Tomiaçu is part of the Amazon rainforest. This cocoa was sourced from the Canta cooperative. What you are doing by making these kinds of choices to taste these kinds of foods and drinks is supporting agricultural biodiversity. With every bite that we take, we are setting in motion a different kind of agricultural system, one that supports ecosystems and one that considers the very precious places from which cacao is grown. So after you've tasted this one, as our final, I'd like you to move to the red. If you are vegan, hand the red off to your neighbor because it's milk chocolate. And what you'll taste here is in this 52%. So basically chocolate is, these chocolates are comprised of very few things, which is absolutely extraordinary. It's the cocoa, it's some additional cocoa butter, and it's sugar. And then with the case of the milk, it's also non-fat milk that's present in the chocolate. But you are tasting here probably something that's very different from the Hershey bar or the Snicker bar or the Twix bar you may have had earlier. You're tasting some of the diversity that comes from Brazil. These tastes that you're experiencing are unique to that region. And you can try chocolates from all over the world that will exhibit some of these same differences. So what I want to invite you to do as we move into these future presentations is consider the bigger questions of why this diversity isn't present in more of the products that we consume. Seek out the places where you can find this diversity. It is easy to find. It is craft chocolate, it is craft beer, it is specialty coffee, it is all around us. It is at the farmers markets, it is in specialty stores. It is there if we reach for it. And meal by meal and seed by seed, we will transform this system. But the revolution starts by looking at the pillars of our own diets and making these simple changes, starting with chocolate, starting with some small part of our diet and expanding out from there. The way to transform our food system and reclaim our table is to understand why we eat what we eat and to know when to savor what's cultivated and conserve what's wild. To understand what we're losing so we know what to reclaim. Thank you.